Good afternoon, everyone. This is Maritza Jones, and I serve as the Managing Director of Division 2. I see that we have a little bit over 300 participants joining us today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to start by thanking all of you for joining us. Since our last webinar, we have, of course, continued our communication following each of the administrative committee calls and decisions, as well as following any important decisions from the President's Council. But we really thought that another webinar was warranted to update you on the actions taken over the past couple of months since we last had one. So before we get started, as usual, I want to note a few housekeeping items. First, we will not be taking questions during the webinar, but we are recording the webinar, and we plan to post the recording on the Division 2 compliance page on NCAA.org as soon as we have it available to us. So just like we did with the previous one. So if any of your colleagues wasn't able to participate, please let them know. Also, as it relates to regulatory matters, our AMA staff has continued to update the question and answer document, and that document also resides on the Division 2 compliance page. And for those of you who don't know, all you have to do to reach this page is go to ncaa.org, hover over D2, and then click compliance. So those are really the housekeeping items. Today, we're going to cover actions taken by the administrative committee following our last webinar at the end of May. And you can see the agenda on the slide. But before I turn it over to our AMA staff to start us off with those action items, I also wanted to present a couple of updates that are really not necessarily reflected in the chart that we sent you after each AdCom call. The most recent action that our governance structure has taken is obviously the decision made last Wednesday by the President's Council to cancel 2020 Fall Championships. If you can go to the next slide. You can see that decision was made following the Board of Governors directive for each of the 3 divisions to take appropriate actions based on several requirements identified and approved by the board related to health and safety, student-athlete well-being, and championships. So I wanted to start with championship-related issues, which was, as I mentioned, the first decision that the President's Council made last week. So as you can see in the slide, in order for the Division 2 move forward with fall championships, the Board of Governors directed each of the divisions with a few guidelines. If we decided to conduct fall in the fall as a division, we would have to follow principles associated with developing enhanced safety for student-athlete and other essential athletics personnel, which include, among other things, regular testing, separation of student-athletes and essential personnel from other non-essential personnel, and obviously physical distancing and masking policies during all aspects of competition. In addition, the board noted that if 50% or more of eligible teams in a particular sport in a division cancel or postpone their fall season, then there would be no fall championship in that sport. And as you know, in Division 2, we have already seen most of our fall sports fall under that 50%. In fact, the only sport that actually currently remains over the 50% as of this morning when I checked is football, which is at 55%. Then if we wanted to conduct fall in the spring, that had to be based on the scientific data available at the time, as well as an assessment of operational, logistical, and financial impact of moving in that manner. We also had to have a plan for scaling down the number of championship sites, including the possibility of single sites, reducing brackets, fewer competitions, and similar actions to really create efficient and effective events. And finally, the board noted that as a division, we could allow for some fall sport championships to occur and others not be conducted based on the level of risk to the student athlete, but and this was an important but, in all instances, decisions had to comport with the association's commitment to gender equity. So before moving to the other two directives, we really wanted to share some of the information that the Precedence Council received and also share some of the discussions that ultimately supported the decision that was made. So if you look at the next slide, the Precedence Council discussed three scenarios. Obviously, conduct 2020 Fall Championships in the fall as they were scheduled, conduct 2020 Fall Championships in the spring semester of 2021, or cancel Fall 2020 Championships. If you look at the next slide, the Precedence Council also discussed all of the modifications that our current championships would have to undergo in order to conduct fall championships in a safe manner. Just a few of the items that were discussed were by the Precedence Council was we would have to reduce the number of sites by about half. We would also have to convert all the sites to predetermined. We would have to increase the time between selections and travel. We would have to make sure to prioritize winter and spring championships because, as we know, those seasons were already affected earlier this year. We would have to evaluate travel and hotel capacity limitations. And finally, we would have to confirm availability of officials with alternate plans. If you look at the next slide, if the ultimate decision from the Precedence Council was to consider canceling Fall 2020 championships, then it would be based on several factors: current and near-term health conditions, not being able to maintain or identify alternate sites and hosts, testing supplies and equipment, and obviously participation levels. So finally, as we transition to the next slide, yes, the Precedence Council was provided with information that really painted the financial picture for the entire fiscal year for Division II as it relates to our expenses. So as a comparison point, if you look at the 18-19 expenses, which is really the last full year that we have to compare, we spent about $23.6 million in our championships. And for this year, this upcoming 2021 year, our budget for championships is $25.1 million. So you can see the different options presented to the Precedence Council. If the Precedence Council was to decide to conduct all championships as scheduled in 2021, we would need to invest approximately $48.3 million. That's almost double our current budget. Same cost or a little bit higher if we decided to conduct all championships this year but move fall championships to the spring. The total cost that we're anticipating would be $49.3 million. Again, almost double the budget that we have for this year. The next option is the option that was ultimately made at the Precedence Council with no fall championships and continue with winter and spring championships. With all of the modifications that we will have to do to host winter and spring championships in a safe manner, we're anticipating that our cost will go to $32.6 million. That means that we still need to find $7.5 million to host those championships. And then you can see the other two options which would be within budget, would be to conduct only spring championships. That's about a $20 million investment, and no championships this year. We would have minimal expenses, about $1.9 million. So as we look into the next slide, after discussing all the options, including some potential analysis on reducing brackets, the council ultimately felt that even with any efforts to look into bracket reductions, we just wouldn't be able to afford to host fall championships, either logistically or financially. So we would just be delaying a decision that had to be made according to the Board of Governors directive by August 21. And I want to pause here and assure you that this was not a decision that came lightly to the presidents that are part of the President's Council or to any of the staff that supports them. It was a decision that took time to discuss, and it was a decision that was made with a heavy heart, but knowing that it was the best decision for the division. So, as I mentioned before, championships related decisions was just one of 3 parts of the directive, and the only decision that was made that has been made at this point. But I also want to share briefly with you the directives that relate to the other 2 parts, which are student athlete well-being and health and safety. So in the slide you have decisions related, or the directives related to student athlete well-being. Those decisions, according to the directives from the Board of Governors, are due by August 21. So, and actually, I think that's a mistake on the slide. I think those decisions are due by August 14. So similar to what we do with every other issue, the President's Council charged our governance committees with discussing these issues and bringing forward recommendations. So this week, our governance committees will be discussing, among other issues, any additional eligibility accommodations that have to be provided for student athletes who opt out of participating this fall. And as you probably all know, the Division II Committee on Student Athlete Reinstatement has already provided some flexibility in this area. The second item is ensuring athletics aid for those student athletes that also decide to opt out, and what needs to be done regarding 2 other directives that you see in the slide, covering COVID-19 medical expenses for student athletes and waiving legal rights. So again, several committees are going to be involved in this review and feedback, and several affiliated groups. So we expect those decisions to be finalized by the administrative committee following input from those committees this week. As it relates to health and safety, which is the third big bucket of directives, and it's in the next slide, there were also some directives that the SSI is working on and are listed on the slide. We do understand that the SSI staff is working on a document that hopefully will be released shortly that will clarify many of the questions on how this directive would apply to Division II institutions, especially now that there will be no fall championships. However, if you have any questions in this area, once you receive the additional FAQ document, we encourage you to continue to send those questions to ssi@ncaa.org. The last note that I'll make before turning it over to my colleagues is that really our division's response related to COVID-19 is that our work continues, and our approach since the beginning of this pandemic has been to provide flexibility to our membership in this time and make decisions that are in the best interest of our student athletes and our institutions. And just rest assured that we will continue to do so while following our governance process. So I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Karen Wolf to summarize some of the regulatory decisions that have been made since the last webinar.
Thank you, Maritza. I'm going to start by talking about the playing and practice seasons area, which I know all of you have been working hard with your institutions and conferences as all of this continues to evolve to give your student athletes a meaningful experience for the 2021 academic year. The administrative committee approved a blanket waiver that allows institutions and conferences, if they desire, to adjust practice and competition schedules in our Division II championship sports. For sake of ease of reference, I know that there were a number of communications that came out from the administrative committee. I think those decisions were made over the course of 3 separate calls. We did put together a reference document that is housed on the Division II compliance page that Maritza referenced earlier. You see a screenshot there. It is the 3rd bullet under the resources for the 2020-21 academic year. And that document outlines the start and end date for each of the sports in the championship segment, the number of days, and the non-championship segment layout. I do just want to make a note that there are a number of caveats for each of those elements. So make sure when you're looking at that document that you're looking at the footnotes that are reflected for each sport so that you have the full comprehensive detail. But as Maritza mentioned, the goal here really was to ensure that institutions and conferences had all the flexibility necessary to have as close to full seasons as possible should health conditions allow. We have gotten some questions on emerging sports and national collegiate sports. The relief at this point is just for our Division II championship sports. The emerging sports and national collegiate sports have similar playing and practice season legislation to Divisions 1 and 3. And at this point, those divisions have not amended their legislation for those sports. And so to ensure that our Division II teams have the opportunities to continue to compete against their peers and their multi-division peers in this instance, that is why there has been no action to date taken for those sports, but certainly it may be possible in the future. I will note right now those sports already have considerable flexibility in managing their playing and practice season. The other thing I want to note as it relates to playing and practice seasons is just that the hour limitations in terms of daily and weekly hour limitations will remain the same. So in season, non-championship segment, and out of season hour requirements will maintain the current legislation. No change there. Really, this flexibility is around the start and end dates for the season and allowing institutions and conferences to declare a window of time that they deem appropriate and makes the most sense based on the variety of factors involved. But the amount of time expected of our student athletes, again, in season, during the non-championship segment, and out of season will remain the same. Similarly, a lot of conversation had by Legislation Committee, National SAC, and the Administrative Committee on the winter break for 2020. And the Administrative Committee did affirm that winter break will need to be followed this year, as it always is. So no practice and competition December 21 through 27. So I will now turn it over to Julie Sargent to talk to you about the relief through Committee on Student Athlete Reinstatement.
All right, thank you, Karen. So I'm going to touch on a season of competition waivers and extension of eligibility waivers. So starting with season of competition waivers, during the 2020-21 academic year, institutions will be able to self-apply season of competition waivers if the student athlete's team participates in 50% or less of the new bylaw 17 max, so long as the student athlete actually triggers use of a season of competition and the student athlete was otherwise eligible for competition. Moving on to extension requests. Institutions will be able to self-apply extension of eligibility waivers for 2 semesters or 3 quarters for student athletes who qualify for the previously stated season of competition waiver, or for student athletes who are unable to participate during the academic year due to cancellation of this season. Again, the student athletes must have been otherwise eligible, and all the criteria needs to be met regardless of their year of enrollment. I will say this is the current relief provided due to COVID-19. However, there will be discussions about how to ensure student athletes who opt out also get appropriate relief. Please note, institutions still have the ability to file waivers for individual student athletes, even if the team participates in more than 50%, and the student athlete reinstatement staff will evaluate those cases on a case-by-case basis. Finally, as a reminder, please review the previously approved request list posted on ncaa.org because your circumstances may fit into one of those areas listed. So those are the updates from student athlete reinstatement specific to season of competitions and extensions. So next, I will send it back over to Angela.
Thank you, Julie, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here with you all. I'm going to just provide a couple of updates. The first on the next slide as it relates to organized competition. So the administrative committee did take action to waive the application of organized competition legislation to permit those students who have not previously enrolled full-time at a collegiate institution and whose legislated grace period ends before the 2021 academic year to engage in organized competition during the 2021 academic year without using a season of competition. This waiver will be applied during the Eligibility Center amateurism certification process, so institutions can see that reflected in the student athletes certification on the institutional request list. On the next slide, I will just talk on a couple of items as it relates to just the future items for discussion by the administrative committee as they are continuing to meet on Wednesday afternoon. So as everyone should be aware, the quiet period is in place right now through August 31. The administrative committee will have continued discussions about whether or not to extend that beyond that date. The next item, the two items in the academic space, the first is the initial eligibility requirements for the class of 2021. The administrative committee will review a few recommendations that came from the Eligibility Center and were reviewed by our academic requirements committee, as well as full-time enrollment requirements for the 2021 academic year. So just a couple of items to just be on the lookout here in the coming week on any decision made by the administrative committee. And with that, I will turn it over to Ryan.
Thank you, Angela. And this is Ryan Jones, and I'm the Associate Director of Division II. Before we wrap up today, the Division II Administrative Committee will meet this Wednesday to take action on additional policies and regulations impacted by COVID-19. We will continue to send out a membership communication following the meeting to summarize the actions that occurred. As Maritza mentioned at the very beginning, a recording of today's webinar will be posted to the D2 compliance page on ncaa.org and shared by email. As always, please feel free to contact any of the Division II staff members if we can be of assistance. And finally, thank you for all you continue to do for Division II and Division II student athletes. Take care, be safe, and thanks for tuning in to today's membership webinar.